So today we're going to talk about the excuses and the objections that families often make to either not do an intervention or to put off doing an intervention. And before we get started, I want to go over 4 definitions. I want to go over the definition of a question, the definition of a rhetorical question, the definition of an excuse, and the definition of an objection. The definition of a question, per the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is, and keep in mind, a question can be a noun and a verb, and there's a huge difference. So when used as a noun, it is an interrogative expression often used to test knowledge. A question, when used as a verb, is used to dispute or doubt information. And we're going to get into that later, because what you will start to realize is that most families ask us questions in the form of a verb, which is somewhat it has objections in the questions. A rhetorical question is a question that's not intended to require an answer. An excuse is, when used as a verb, are to make an apology for, to remove blame for, to forgive entirely or disregard as the trivial import, and to grant release to. When used as a noun, an excuse is used to offer justification or grounds for being excused. And anybody watching this knows that we often, as family, make excuses for our loved ones and sometimes even other family members' behavior that goes against one getting well. And then, of course, an objection. And an objection is an active objection. In other words, it's a reason or an argument, and it's presented in opposition, a feeling of expression or disapproval. So when we look at that, families throw up objections and they throw up a lot of excuses. We find that when we're on the phone with a family during a consultation, we are spending far more time handling a family's objections and excuses to not do an intervention than our interventionist ever will handling objections and excuses for your loved one with substance use or mental health disorders to accept help. So I want you to think about that. I really want that to sink in. We spend more time handling family excuses and objections and reasons not to do an intervention than we ever will handling objections and excuses from your loved one who needs help. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each objection and excuse that is in the article on our website for excuses that families make to not do an intervention or put off doing an intervention. And the first one, by far, that we hear from families is, what if my loved one says no? And to an outsider looking in, they'd think, well, that's a fair question. The problem is that that question is not asked in the form of a noun. Families almost always ask that question in the form of a verb, and here's how I know that. Families ask that because they know that if we don't give the answer of 100%, they can psychologically justify not doing this. And then I think if it were any other fatal illness or any other medical problem, you would still move forward because you know that nothing has a 100% guarantee. But what we did one time is it was a clinical trial, a case study, if you will. And we don't do this anymore, so after watching this, don't call my office and say, where's my free intervention? But we went ahead and we took 100 people that when they asked us, what if our loved one says no? We responded with, they won't. And if they do, we will give you back all of your money. I guarantee you that they are going to accept help at this intervention. Of those 100 people, not one of them took us up on that offer, which tells me 2 things. Number one, they asked the question just to throw up an objection, never thinking in a million years that would be my response. And the other reason they asked that question is so that they don't have to do anything. And if it was really about saying no, and I gave them a guarantee that their loved one would say yes, then why didn't they move forward? Because at the end of the day, the fact that you ask me, what if they say no, tells me who's running the show. I've got a large group of people, sane and healthy, mind you, such as yourselves watching this, being controlled by one person with substance use or mental health disorders. If anybody in the world should be worried about hearing the word no, it should be them. You guys are so used to saying yes, you don't even know what the word no means. All you hear from them is no, and all they hear is yes from you. So when somebody says to me, what if they say no? What I can tell you is this: getting a no at an intervention is 1,000 times better than not trying to do an intervention at all and never even getting near hearing a yes. Because at the end of the day, families are in a much stronger position than they're led to believe by themselves and their loved one. And if your loved one says no, there's a whole entire protocol and aftercare department for that. And we also know as clinicians that when you ask that question, that's not your question, because after 19 years of doing this, at the time I'm shooting this video, what I can tell you is I have 2 aftercare departments. When people say yes to treatment, when people say no. And the loved ones who say yes, those families struggle 10 times more in our aftercare than the ones who say no, because you know how to do a no. A no is all you've ever lived with. What families fear the most is when their loved one says yes, goes to treatment, and things start to change, and families then have to look at themselves. So when you ask us what if they say no, just really ask yourself, where is that question coming from? And does my answer have any bearing on whether or not you're gonna try to do something? Because I'll tell you this, we hear no from families all the time, and we hear yes when people are ready from the substance user or the person with mental health to go to treatment almost all the time. So in other words, getting families to do this is 10 times harder than getting somebody to say yes to treatment. The second biggest objections we hear from families is the problem is only mental health. And how do we handle that? Now, what I can tell you is that we do about 400 interventions a year. Of those 400, on average, only 2 cases per year turn out to be only mental health with no substance use, past or present. 90+% of families call our office and swear that's what it is. Why do they do that? Well, I can tell you why. And this is not, again, a Mike Lavertyism or a family first interventionism. This is what I hear from healthy families in our aftercare department and why they wanted it to be mental health and not addiction. Because it's easier to digest and it justifies enabling. It's a lot harder to explain why you gave a fentanyl addict or a meth addict $50, or why you're letting a crack user, an alcoholic, live in your home rent-free. But when you can hide behind a bipolar diagnosis, then you can do those things and feel less, and don't feel as guilty in doing so. So before I go any further, I am not here to discount mental health disorders that your loved one may have. What I'm here to tell you, and if you go on our website, Excuses Families Make to Not Do an Intervention, you may already be there, you will see quotes from the WHO, the American Association of Addiction Medicine, the DSM, et cetera, where it states, and in textbooks from that I have, that no clinician at any point in time can diagnose a mental health disorder when any substance use is present, even at minimal levels. So what we're saying is that the interventionist job is to get your loved one to treatment. Interventions are about resistance to treatment, not the drug of choice or the mental health diagnosis. So we need you to get off of, is it bipolar, is it mania, is it schizophrenia? We have to get with the family to help you guys identify why they're not accepting help and advocating for their own care, regardless of the ailment. Our interventionists we send you will not be their primary clinician, and they will not be the treatment center. Their job is to help you guys get to a place of strength and hope and boundaries and accountability, to be educated on substance use and mental health and behavior so that you can make informed decisions on what you should do next that'll increase the opportunity for your loved one to accept help and be far less resistant to treatment and advocating for their own care. So families always want to tell us that the problem is mental health. What are you going to do differently? And of course, depending on the background information you give us, there's a lot of things we may do differently. And at the end of the day, we need to get them to treatment so they can be stripped of any and all drugs or alcohol, if in fact that is present, so that the clinicians at the facility could bring them to a baseline and they can rebuild from there so they can get a true diagnosis. And lastly, a lot of people want to throw out, well, they've been diagnosed with this, that, and the other since the age of 5. Guys, it doesn't mean it's an accurate diagnosis. There's a link on our website where organizations such as ASAM and the DSM explicitly state how overwhelmingly inaccurate doctors are in diagnosing and prescribing psychiatric medications. They spend very little time with your loved one. Most of them make the diagnosis in a time of crisis with a short stay in a mental hospital or through a family physician and a routine office visit. So just because I had a diagnosis of bipolar early on doesn't mean that's accurate later in life. And there's another page on our website under the services section about mental health interventions and dual diagnosis, and I have a personal experience on there with my own family member that you may want to watch about how they were diagnosed early on, and when we took away the insurance, became a self-pay client, all of a sudden the diagnoses were never added, and they were no longer discussed, and they were treated based on their behaviors and things that they needed to do to cope with life. So again, is it mental health? I don't know. Is it addiction? I don't know. But what I do know is they're not advocating for their own care, and they are resistant to treatment, and it's our job to help them get there. Another objection we often hear is we can't afford the intervention. And before I go any further, I understand that finances are an issue for some. That can't be disputed. But what I do know is that families often hide behind this as either an objection or an excuse, saying that they can't afford the intervention and or treatment. And we know the majority of families who do say they can't afford it can. And the reason we know this is families who can't afford the intervention will ask questions. They will ask financing options. They will ask what is available to help them. Is there any type of assistance? They won't just throw up the objection and leave it at that and drop it. It's almost like they'll just say, we can't afford this, but not ask anything. I mean, if you needed medical care for something that may take your life and you had no insurance or finances, you would ask the doctor and the nurses 1,000 questions as to how you can get that in your position. The fact that you don't ask us one question tells us that that's not your objection. And the families who actually try to do this through financing or whatever other means possible, we know they're sincere. And I always have to add in that one of the people that work here, one of our employees, they worked for a large jewelry store. And they would explain to me how many times people would walk into these jewelry stores, clearly not in a position to afford anything in the store with the money on hand. And they would finance jewelry they don't need that far exceed the cost of our services and or treatment. So I wonder, if people can do that, why can't people do this? Because I know that if it were any other medical problem, families would move mountains to do what they had to do to get the care that they needed to save their loved one's life. And guys, this is not to guilt or shame you. I understand there's people watching this that truly cannot afford it. But it's all, the tell's in the questions. If you wanted to do this, you would ask for help if you truly didn't have the money. So when you don't ask for help, and then on top of it, people will watch this video, ask for help, and then we'll give it to you, and you still won't do it. So we'll always know where you're at based on your response. Another objection is, why can't we do the intervention ourselves, or the DIY intervention? And why this one's scary is this one is the one I call the silent killer. And the reason I call it that is because some families will bring it up, but a lot of families will not go ahead and tell us that they're going to do it themselves, because after hearing what we have to say, they realize what a horrible idea it is. I mean, doing an intervention yourself is like representing yourself in a major court appearance. You know, doing an intervention yourself is like doing your taxes by somebody who absolutely has no idea how to do their taxes. Doing an intervention yourself is like trying to take on any other trade that you have absolutely no clue as to how to do that trade. And I think the disconnect is families think they could do the intervention themselves because often the hero brother, the oldest child in the family, not always but often, is going to be the guy to come in and give the speech, either that guy or dad. And they're going to talk their loved one into treatment. And guys, interventions are not an event where you talk somebody into treatment. That's a 12-step call that is a free service offered by members of your local 12-step meeting halls. An intervention is about a professional helping you guys understand where you're at, how you got here, how your family roles have affected the outcomes, how those family roles need to change, the psychoeducation of addiction and mental health, the manipulations. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, this is a 3-day process that families call our office and tell us they're going to do themselves in 15 minutes. And I can't tell you how many families have called us, hired us after the fact because they're DIY bombed, or called to rub it in our face that their loved one said yes to treatment. And we'll say, well, where are they? Well, they're still here. Well, why aren't they in treatment? Well, they said they were going to go on Monday. Follow up next week, they never take the call again. They never went. And the point is that even if you did pull off what we think is the impossible, you trying to do our job, and your loved one went to treatment for 90 days out of state and they did well, it still doesn't change your family system that's broken and the dysfunction that was a large contributor to this problem. So what happens then is there you go thinking you just did our job, you were successful, they went to treatment, they're doing great, and more happier I could not be. But then they come home to that same family dysfunction, and I've been doing this so long to know that you suck them back in, and they eventually relapse. The chances of your loved one going to treatment, doing everything they're supposed to do, and then knowing how to detach from their dysfunctional family, or the family actually getting better and that coming back as a cohesive unit without professional help, is very, very rare, if not impossible. So just remember, when you guys say you're going to do the intervention yourself, I'll give you that, but please don't use the word intervention in vain, because you're not doing an intervention yourself. You're just going to go give a speech. Don't forget the difference, please. Another objection we hear all the time is, what's your guarantee? And I think a lot higher than the guarantee you'll get by doing nothing. Families who ask us about the guarantee, it's almost the same response I give you guys when we talk about what are your success rates. It's almost the same as all the other objections that I've handled. When we talk about a guarantee, I think about every other problem in life that has no guarantee. So when you go to the doctor and they tell you what's wrong, do you ask them for a guarantee? No, you don't. Some may say, oh yeah, no you don't. And even if you did, would their response stop you from following their advice? And that answer is definitely a hard no. So again, if you watch the We Can't Afford the Intervention objection video, we did the same case study. So that when family said with 100 people, there might have been 150 people on this one. Actually, I think it was. And people asked us what was the guarantee, and 100% guarantee, your loved one's going. And you see the looks on their faces on the video call. And they start getting jammed up. It's like, I guarantee you your loved one will go, or 100% money back guarantee. Now again, for those watching and who want to call my office and say, we don't do this anymore. It was done for a purpose because we knew nobody would take us up on it, and they didn't. So just like the other objections, when somebody says to us, what's your guarantee? They never thought in a million years we'd fire back 100% money back. They weren't prepared for that. And when we took that objection off the table, they never returned our calls or answered the phone again. And then 6 months, a year down the road, you'd get a call from one of the other family members saying that the person was in jail, they may have passed, the situation's gotten worse, and they still won't get on the phone with us. And we gave them a 100% money back guarantee. And for the record, I didn't do this as a joke. Had somebody taken me up in this, I would have honored it. I would have had to. It was a case study, and I knew going into it, I knew nobody would do it. But had they done it, I would have totally honored it. And the reason why we did it again was to prove the point that when you ask me, what is your guarantee rate? That is an objection, and that is a question asked in the form of a verb. You're asking it just to ask it, to psychologically justify that if it's not 100%, you're not going to do anything. When somebody has pancreatic cancer, I think the statistics of recovery in life and living is 11%. Somebody hears that, they're like, oh my God, it's not zero. And even if it were, they'd still try. If we don't give you 100%, you guys just use that as an excuse to do nothing. It's not a genuine question. We know this. You may think it is. You may watch this video and say, oh my God, this guy's full of hot air. He's just talking fluff. It's true. 150 people, we gave a 100% money back guarantee in a case study, and they never followed through because that wasn't their question. That was their stump. That was their dispute. That was their objection. That was their question in the form of a verb. They weren't going to do it anyway. They just wanted to ask to make us look like fools. Well, guess what? We told you you had a 100% money back guarantee and you ran away. The final objection I'm going to discuss today is the coerced intervention, or having somebody put in treatment against their will. You know, in the video before this, I talked about how the silent killer was the DIY intervention, which is still true. But nothing is more devastating or detrimental to your family and your loved one than you trying to do the job of a highly trained clinician and following the protocol of a coerced intervention. The last thing a family should ever do is have their loved one taken against their will. And before I get into some of the clinical reasons why you shouldn't do that, let's talk about some of the common sense reasons. Addicts, alcoholics, people with mental disorders are notorious for pointing fingers and blaming everybody else for their problems. When you coerce and forcibly put your loved one in treatment, how do you think they're going to perceive that when they're there? Are they going to be there because they went with any type of therapeutic intervention or any type of their own thoughts or consequences? They're going to be there because of you. No intervention in the history of this organization is more difficult to overcome than the family that calls us about their adult loved one who they had taken against their will to a wilderness program in their teens. No intervention in this organization is more difficult than a family who has had their loved one taken against their will at any point in their lives, adult or minor. When you guys start talking about having them forced against their will, that is the job of professionals. If you look at all of my objections, combine them and throw them out the window compared to this one objection. This is the one where I'm going to tell you, if you want to give me excuses, fine. You want to give me objections, fine. I'll live with all the other ones. I know the meaning behind why you're using them and the fact that you're hiding behind them, but that's okay. This one here, stop. Do not coercively bring your one to treatment thinking that you just did something that was going to be therapeutic and effective. So I want to just read a couple of things, and this is on our website underneath the excuses of why families don't intervene section. So one of the most important things that I'm going to read you is from one of my textbooks in school. I have the citation on the website, and it quotes, "Involuntary interventions," in other words, you thinking you're going to force your loved one in, "take away clients, your loved one's self-control, and both involuntary and coerced interventions can and will undermine clients' motivation. And since motivation and self-control are strengths that dual disorder treatment aims to cultivate, the use of involuntary and coerced interventions require particular care." And I also have two more things I wanted to discuss. And again, this is on the website, but it's so important that I put it on this video and read it verbatim per the citations. And again, the citations for these sources are on my website. A coercive and involuntary approach is justified when three things are met. Rules. The involuntary commitment would prevent the harm to the person is so great that the person cannot rationalize the alternative. The person does not have a reason to suffer the harm for involuntary commitment tries to prevent. And the harm will occur to the person if the involuntary commitment is not performed, and it will reduce the likelihood that the harmful act will occur. And those justifications or those rules are dependent on these four scenarios: the seriousness of the harm to be avoided, the extent of the person's rational responsibility, the likelihood of harm, and the likelihood the involuntary intervention will diminish the chance of harm. And, you know, guys, when you go through all that stuff, and I know some of you are like, yeah, they're doing all that. I don't disagree. You cannot put somebody in treatment against their will unless you have a professional present, a court of law, or some type of person, maybe the state you're in has laws like Florida with the Baker Act. So whatever you do, if you want to use objections and excuses, if you want to do your own intervention, although ill-advised on all that, the last thing I want anybody doing is thinking that they're going to go in there and they're going to go through the motions and just drag their loved one into treatment or use some type of method that is not evidence-based to force their loved one into treatment through a coerced intervention. Please, if that's your route, stop. We are now going to talk about excuses families make to not do an intervention or to not get their loved one help. Excuses are different from objections where they're just blatantly obvious. And having done this as long as we have heard every excuse you can imagine. And on our website, under the excuses families make to not do an intervention, we've listed the most common. And there's about 25 or 30 of them. And there's tons more. We've heard everything from they shave their beard, which they haven't done in 3 years, so we're going to hold off, to they just got a new dog and I think that'll fix them. And guys, this is not meant to be funny. These are real excuses families give us. If you're making an excuse not to do this, then you're making an excuse to stay sick. The excuses families make to not do an intervention pale in comparison to the excuses the person will tell us for the reasons that they do not need to go to treatment to our interventionists when they're on site. Families make excuses to not intervene, address their family dysfunction at a rate that is 10 times greater than the substance user. We're all talking about the substance user's excuses to not get help, and yet our entire organization is built around bringing you to a point of doing an intervention. I'm going to break this down just to summarize this. The intervention itself is the easiest part of the job. The day that our professional arrives to meet with you and goes through the family day and meets with your loved one, easiest part. The part most families fear, easiest part. The hardest part of being a real intervention company, I mean a real one, not a solo interventionist that comes in, gives you some brochures on enabling and gives a speech. I mean a real intervention company. All of our work is getting your entire family to the point of doing this. On the back end, all of our work is helping you guys stay focused and grounded as you go through the volatility of your loved one's response. In other words, if they've said, yes, you're going to struggle, and if they said, no, you're going to struggle. And the excuses that you guys will make, and I get they're coming from a place of dysfunction and unhealthy family roles and protection and defense mechanisms. But guys, the excuses are just excuses. Remember, victims say, why me? And survivors say, what's next? Stop living like your loved one with the excuses and start doing something about the problem, because inaction never solved any problems in addiction and mental health. The way that family roles and family dysfunction affect addiction and mental health treatment outcomes is profound. If you watch our video underneath the why families, or the excuses families make to not do an intervention in the DIY video, you will see what we're talking about in these family roles. You'll see a lot of the family roles in all the objections, but never more so than in that one. And the reason why I say that is there's a lot of roles, but there's three that I'm going to focus on that almost always are the reason why interventions don't happen. And remember, and I say this in all the videos, families make more excuses and have more objections to not help their loved one than their loved one will have for us to not accept the help that we offer. Don't forget that. It's tenfold. It's 10 to 1, your excuses versus theirs. So the three family roles that I'm going to focus on are the enabler, the hero, and the martyr. The enabler almost never wants the intervention to occur for selfish reasons. It doesn't make you bad or wrong. It's a role that you didn't ask for. It's a role you are now, so don't think I'm beating you up. But what your goal is to be the caretaker of the enabler, or of the substance user. Your role is to be needed in the relationship. Your role is to avoid confrontation. Your role is to keep the person comfortable. Your role is to feel better when your loved one feels better. And then, of course, you'll feel worse when they feel worse. But what most people don't understand is that the enabler has the biggest impact on the overall family system, because what happens is when the primary enabler gives all their attention to the one person who needs help, all the other people underneath the roof or in the family system suffer, and that's when the other roles blossom. And the role that blossoms and sabotages interventions more than anything else is the hero. And the hero role is all over our website. And you always know who the hero is, and never more so than when you send an article on the hero and they call the office and scream at us and threaten legal action because we just basically described them to a T. But the hero does one of two things. If they're the original caller, intervention's happening, it's their idea, they're running the show, the hero is the greatest asset to an intervention when they've done their homework, they've made the original call, they found family first intervention, this is their idea. When it's not their idea and any other family member calls, they will destroy this on you. The reason they do that is it wasn't their idea. And when we do conference calls or family consultations, the hero is so easy to spot, because it'd be one of two people. They will sit there and say nothing. And when we ask them for input or how they're doing, they'll either say they're good or they're Gucci, almost arrogantly. They say that. And they will wait for that call to end, and as soon as that call is over, they will call everybody that was on that conference call and they will pounce. That guy was an idiot. That guy was a salesman. That place will never work. That place sucks. And they will derail everything or at least try to anyway. So I'm preparing you now. That's what happens with the silent client on the conference call. The hero can also be the person on the call that overpowers the call, has all the objections, all the excuses, and tries to make us look foolish. And they try to jam us up. They're the ones that almost always have all the excuses, objections, as I just said, because this wasn't their idea. Because the biggest fear of the hero, whose drug of choice is perfectionist, they are terrified of two things. Number one, the person who needs help gets better and steals the spotlight from them. And the second is the other person gets better without them having a hand in the solution. We have clients, I want you to put this in their perspective. I have people who have been sober 2 and 3 years. The hero still calls our offices and says, we did this the wrong way. Everybody else in the family is happy, the hero's pissed. And the reason why, the hero can go to Harvard, get a law degree and an MBA, and be acknowledged a little. The substance user or your loved one with mental health can have a good day and there's a block party. That's an extreme example, but the hero watching this, who's hating me right now, gets it. Because they're fighting for that primary enabler's attention. That primary enabler has given everything to the person who's failing. So the perfectionist does what? The opposite. They're all getting all this attention for failing. I have to overcompensate. But there's also one other hero that most people don't talk about. It's the one who's also using drugs in the house, just not as much as the one we're intervening on. That guy or girl doesn't want the intervention because God forbid we get the person who's worse than them to treatment. Now all eyes on them and they sabotage interventions too. So when you call our office, we can get into more detail, but heroes sabotage interventions and they derail them. And just before I wrap up the hero, I'm gonna give you one example. I had a family that called me back after several conversations. Her and her husband were on the phone. I hope they end up watching this. I had my CEO in my office. He heard the call. Mike, it's so-and-so and so-and-so. We are ready to move forward. Can you be here tomorrow? They never once told me there was another son. They never once told me he was the oldest. They never once told me anything about this person. I assumed, and I think even when I had asked them, they said, no, it was just this, just the one and another daughter. But there was another son, the hero. They said to me, we are ready to move forward. Can you be here tomorrow? And I said, yes. I said, my CEO is in my office. He will call you back. I am not exaggerating. I can pull this call recording. 15 seconds. He walked from my office to his office, which is probably 30 feet away. No answer. No answer. No, never heard from him in 3 weeks. Do you realize in that, now this is like winning the lotto. In that 15 seconds, their son called, the hero. Just to call, say hi. They told, he exploded this thing and ripped it to shreds. The dad called me back 3 weeks later and told me what happened. And he turned on me like an enemy. And his son, the hero, did such a number on, their loved one is still failing per the other family members that still call because this hero, know-it-all brother, in 15 seconds prevented us from saving his brother's life. Because, God forbid, he gets better and takes away his spotlight, or God forbid he gets better and it wasn't his idea. There's people watching this and are not gonna like it. They're gonna think I'm being disrespectful. Guys, this is textbook. This isn't my opinion. This is what heroes do. Textbooks are nice about explaining the hero. I'm telling you how they act in real life. They're scary, they're detrimental, they derail interventions, unless it's their idea. And lastly, there's the martyr. The martyr is the forever victim. It's almost always a spouse, and their big thing is, if I have to do this intervention, my loved one gets well, then I can no longer be a victim. Who's gonna pay their bills when they're in treatment? What's gonna happen to me? The whole thing about their loved one getting well is what happens to them if they do or they don't. And their biggest fear is if their loved one goes to treatment, and let's say it's a wife or a husband, what if they go to treatment and they get better and they don't love me anymore, they don't like me, or they find flaw in me? I don't wanna say the martyr's job is to keep their loved one sick, but the martyr's job is to keep their loved one sick. And just remember, I'm gonna summarize this quickly. Not one of these roles is a bad person. Not one of these roles has ill will intent consciously. And all of these roles, and this goes for the scapegoat, the lost child, the mascot, the other clinical roles, which don't affect the outcomes very much. They try, but not much. That's why we're not talking about them. But nothing derails an intervention more than these family roles. And these family roles don't understand how sick they are. And this is why families with your DIY interventions, we're gonna talk to them ourselves. You're not doing an intervention. You can't address these without a professional. And if you don't address them, your loved one doesn't stand a chance of having long-term recovery if they're coming back to a dysfunctional family system. So what are the consequences of your family saying no to doing an intervention, or the consequences of putting off the intervention? As long as I've been doing this, I have heard over and over and over again, we're in a holding pattern. We're taking baby steps. We're taking it day by day. And when you tell us those things, we know your loved one isn't. Your loved one is still ripping through their life and yours like a tornado. And the biggest reason families make excuses, above all the other videos and the content that's on our excuses of why families don't do an intervention article, is because they're avoiding the confrontation, they're fearful of the outcome, and they're afraid of what's going to happen afterwards. You know, it goes back to, what if my loved one says no? That is by far and wide the biggest fear and the questions family ask. But the real fear is, and I know people are going to look at me like I got two heads, but I'm going to say it. You're scared your loved one's going to say yes. Because when your loved one says yes, that requires change. Families already know how to handle a no. Their excuses come from having to let go of their family role, having to sit in the silence of their loved one being gone in treatment, having to identify what it is that they've done to allow it to get this bad, or maybe even contributed to the problem. The consequences of a family not getting their loved one professional and medical attention are devastating. Think about it. I mean, if you had any other medical problem and you said no to it or you put it off, what would happen? And that's what happens when families don't do an intervention. And guys, I want to remind you what an intervention is. Let's remember, an intervention is a clinical instrument that's used hundreds of times a day by each professional throughout their job, meaning they are a strategy used to address a behavior and to meet a specific goal of addressing that behavior. There's all kinds of interventions: government intervention, surgical intervention, early intervention for early childhood education, addiction intervention, mental health intervention. Guys, an intervention is happening whether you come up with the excuses or the objections or not. Either you intervene on your terms or society intervenes on its terms. And I can tell you, after almost 2 decades of doing this, that when society intervenes, you can't do anything about that. Once the law gets their hands on your loved one, once they've passed, once they've put themselves into a position they can't come back from, family too, getting in that same position, you're going to regret choosing the path of inaction, because the consequences of doing nothing are far worse than the consequences of trying to help yourself and your loved one. So this video is for the ones who have actually done an intervention. And the purpose of what I'm going to say here is to help you guys understand the importance of following through with our family aftercare. Because the excuses families make to not listen to us after the intervention are the same excuses that families make not to do an intervention. When I say the same, I don't mean the exact words, but the reasons and the intent behind the excuses. And it goes back to the DIY video, the do-it-yourself intervention, of what families think an intervention is. If you paid us to come to your house to talk your loved one into treatment and don't think that our family recovery coaching program is going to be beneficial in any way, I'm here to tell you that you need this part more than any other part that we put you through, or that we offer you, or that we guide you through. And I know I said I'd put you through like it was a hard task. What I mean is that our curriculum is designed to do this the right way. We're not the intervention company that comes in, tries to get your loved one to go, they say no, and I go home with a check, and then you call me and I call you back in 3 days. We have a structured curriculum afterwards, and we have a structure to how that works. Right after the intervention, families are called by one of our intake coordinators, and we start the process of you guys joining family recovery. And I can't tell you how important it is to work on yourselves during this time. Guys, the family aftercare is not about talking about what your loved one had for breakfast in treatment. It's not about complaining about your son's wife, who you think is the cause of the reason why he's in a treatment center for his alcoholism. It's not to talk about each other. It's to talk about where are you at in your own recovery. So when you guys make excuses to not be in our aftercare, follow directions, follow the homework that our counselors and our aftercare team gives you, the advice, what goals you're setting for the week, Al-Anon meetings. I mean, it's to the point where if you don't come to our groups having documentation that you attended at least one outside meeting, we may not even let you in. And that's part of our curriculum. Like, we take this serious. Our aftercare department is not to hear your excuses. Our aftercare department is to help you guys get better so your loved one stands a chance. And I say in many of my videos, victims say, why me? Survivors say, what's next? And that's where you guys need to be. We're not talking about what's for lunch at the treatment center. We're not talking about when they're going to call you to check in. We're talking about what did you do for your own recovery, and to stop making excuses. And the number one excuse families make is us. Once your loved one goes to treatment, families fall apart. Everybody thinks, well, if my loved one says no, I'll never be able to handle that. Guys, that's the easiest department in this organization because people are just continuing on with what they've lived with. Now, they're saddened, but they know how to handle it and navigate it. Our groups and our curriculum, handling the people's loved ones who are doing well in treatment, handling those families is by far and wide the hardest part of this curriculum. That's where the excuses to not do anything for your own recovery are in full bloom. Guys, this is a family problem. If you think for 1 second your loved one's going to go to treatment and excel while you sit back and stay the same, and they're going to return to that same dysfunction that they had to leave in order to get well, you might as well bring them home now because they are going to be extremely vulnerable if you guys don't get it together and start doing something for yourself. Get to Al-Anon, get to Codependency Anonymous, get to ACOA, which is Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. Get to Families Anonymous, get to a therapist, double your groups, not your individual sessions, but all the outside groups we have at Family First Intervention. Stop making excuses to not follow through with our aftercare and start getting involved in your own recovery. If you do that, you'll see the results. In this video, I'm going to talk about the excuses that addicts, alcoholics, people with mental health disorders, and dual diagnosis clients or intended patients will make to not accept help or complete treatment. And what's interesting is this video will be way shorter than the excuses families make to not do an intervention, because the excuses that the substance users will make are obvious and they're easily addressed, and the person knows why they're making them. With the family, they're much more in depth. There's a lot more psychology behind them, and they're a lot harder to overcome because the families don't think that the families think that they're real, and we know they're not. But the excuses addicts and alcoholics and people with mental health and dual disorders will make range from, I can't go to treatment because of my job, all the way to, I hate the 12-step program. And always remember this, to sum this up in simplistic terms, if they're not talking about going to treatment, then anything else they're talking about is an excuse not to advocate for their own care. Because remember, an intervention is about addressing the resistance to treatment and the family dysfunction that keeps them comfortable and or pulls them back from making a decision. Not intentionally, but does pull them back. So the excuses they make are very similar to the excuses families make. It's not a coincidence that the excuses that families make and the excuses that their loved ones make are almost identical. If you go back up to the excuses video, or if you go on the excuses why families don't do an intervention or wait to do an intervention website, and you see those excuses, those are almost identical to the excuses your loved one will make. So my point is that this is the only fatal illness, this is the only medical problem. Some call it a disease. I'm not going to give my opinion on where I stand on that, but for those that think it's a disease, then this will all make sense, is that it is the only fatal illness, disease, or medical problem where the patient fights to stay sick, their family fights to keep them sick, and when given effective evidence-based solutions, they run the other way. And if anybody watched my other videos on the guarantee and what if they say no section, you'll also know that even when I've given those guarantees, they ran even further. So we know the problem is at its core the family dysfunction, and it affects the excuses of their loved one. Because remember this, and it's in our intervention manual, anybody watching this that has hired our service, we say in there blatantly obvious. The main reason why somebody says no in treatment is because they don't think the family is going to follow through with the boundaries that they've outlined at the intervention. That's why if you have a copy of our manual, we have a copy of an emotional appeal letter. I don't put in copies of the consequence letter because what happens is families will go ahead, copy that letter, and then not fulfill, because I'd rather you have weak boundaries than no boundaries at all, or weak boundaries than strong boundaries that you can't adhere to or follow. So the reason your loved one makes excuses to not go to treatment is because A, they're not held accountable, and B, you're enabling them, and C, they don't think that you're going to follow through. And then there are some just that they're not ready to stop. But at the end of the day, That's on them. Your recovery is on you. An intervention is not about learning how to control your loved one. It's about letting go of believing you can. So what are the consequences of your loved one saying no to treatment? And it almost goes back to the video on the excuses families make to not do an intervention or wait to do an intervention website of what if they say no. And guys, these are questions we need to be asking you. So if we do an intervention with your family and your loved one and they say no, what are your consequences? What is the accountability? If your individual solo loved one who's overpowering 3, 5, 8, 10, 15 people in the family through manipulation and excuses and anger and fear and resentment and all their other behaviors that fuel addiction and put you in what families love to say a holding pattern, which I've never understood. It's just an excuse to say that. Is that families have to understand that the consequences they set is a question that we have to be asking you. What are you going to do when they say no? Because it comes back to, if they say no, what they're saying is I'm going to continue to run the show. I'm going to continue to use drugs and alcohol. I'm going to continue to not stay med compliant for my mental health. I'm going to continue to not address my dual diagnosis. And you are going to put up with it. You're going to pay for my mistakes. And you're going to let me do whatever it is that I want at your emotional, financial, spiritual, and sometimes physical, and of course, mental expense. So this isn't see, when you say, what if they say no? What are the consequences? It's like, that's on you. We educate you, we prep you, we teach you, we provide you, we guide you, we do everything we're supposed to do. And it's ultimately on you as to whether or not you understand the science. Guys, we're not coming up with family first interventionisms. This isn't the Mike Laverty show. Some may think that it is and it's not. We come from a place of evidence-based treatment. And yes, some of it is a little bit more than others would like to do. Today, therapists are very into coddling clients and empowering them and meeting them where they're at and rolling with the resistance. I've never seen that work. I assure you of that. But there's also a fine line in the best course of action because every client is different. But at the end of the day, nobody goes to treatment when things are going well. Nobody says, hey, my wife asked me to renew the vows. I just paid off the mortgage, just bought a new car. Boss just gave me a promotion. What are those AA guys doing this morning at that meeting? Nobody does that. They walk in there being beaten to a state of reasonableness and having to suffer consequences as a result of their actions and their behaviors. So our job is to help the family identify what consequences are you shielding from. So what are the consequences of them saying no? They need to be there. Whatever those consequences are, they have to be their consequences. You got to stop holding the bag. What is the purpose of family intervention? Before I go any further, I'm going to read a quote that references behavioral family therapy. This is going to be on the excuses families make to not do an intervention or wait to do an intervention website. And the small quotation I'm going to read to you right now, the citation will be there. Families can unintentionally contribute to or maintain clients' ongoing substance use or mental health disorder. I want that to sink in. Because that's who we are at Family First Intervention. We are not interventionists that come in and give psychological speeches to talk your loved one into treatment. That's what most interventionists do. Those are not interventionists. Those are paid 12-step calls. And if you're paying anybody to come to your house, do very little preparation or state the obvious of not giving people money and living in your house, who make one attempt to talk your loved one into treatment, and either take them to treatment and not support you after, or they refuse treatment and they go home with your money and give you hardly any support after, if you gave them $1 or paid for their gas, you overpaid for their services, because members of 12-step help groups will do that for free. It's called service work. Real interventions by professionals who have gone to school and who have credentials know that an intervention, by way of clinical definition, are actions taken to address specific problems or behaviors and to achieve set goals to correct and or improve the outcomes of those conditions and or behaviors. People in recovery with passion, I love them, but those aren't interventionists. That word is thrown around by people who give speeches. We need to address the dysfunctional family system that is unintentionally and most of the time is unaware of what they're doing is contributing to the problem. No family watching this will ever be blamed by our organization that it's your fault. But we will call you out when we know that you're doing nothing or contributing to the problem. And when I say call you out, I mean with respect. Psychoeducation, examples, other families that are in the groups that you'll be attending as a part of our curriculum. That's what we're talking about. Our aftercare department is second to none. It's the biggest part of this organization. The intervention itself is small. Setting it up is a big piece. The aftercare support is the biggest piece. So we implement behavioral family therapy, which is evidence-based treatment, to every aspect of what we do. And some of our approaches can scare families off because it's like, wait a minute, you're not just going to come here and talk my loved one into treatment? You mean we have to do something too? We have to join recovery? We've got to change? You mean we may have been part of the problem? Yes. And again, it's not your fault. Our job as professionals is to help you with this. So I cannot stress enough, if you found that guy that's cheap and fast and local, and he's going to come in with a folder or maybe some printouts of other people's websites, and he's going to give you a couple hours of prep, and he's going to give the attaboy recovery speech, I was just like you, speech to your loved one on the back deck, and they're going to run away to treatment, and you think all is going to be well from that? You overpaid. That's not an intervention. Again, that is a service that you can get for free somewhere else. So if you're ready to address the family system and uncover and repair and address and let go of your old way of thinking so that you may adopt new ways of thinking, then we can help you. How you set up a family intervention is you call our office and you speak to one of our coordinators. That will be the second hardest part of this entire process. Getting the family on the same page, handling all the objections and the excuses you will make, and they will be tenfold to the objections and the excuses your loved one will make when we get there. It's normal, we get it, we understand. We specialize in family dysfunction and how families can affect treatment outcomes for their loved ones. It's okay, we've been there, we help you. And the second, or the easiest part, is the intervention itself. So once we've gotten to a place where you've agreed to allow us to come, we spend the day there, and then the next day we intervene. We may stay a third day, depending on what happens. And families, of course, we can have the conversations if you need us to stay longer. And then after that, regardless of the outcome, is the meat and the potatoes. This is where almost every other interventionist in the country fails, or doesn't do this at all. They do not have a curriculum and an aftercare support team with an office, with real professionals, with real groups, with real individual sessions, sometimes individual sessions, availability to handle flare-ups, potentially your loved one leaving treatment against medical advice, answering the calls later when your loved one who said no is going to agree to go later, team of people to be there for you. And that's who Family First Intervention is. So how you set up an intervention is once you've agreed to let go of your old ideas, we will help you form new ones and get you on the right track. The biggest challenge we face as professionals is families not wanting to let go of their old ideas. Families have to understand that in order to embrace new ideas, you have to let go of the way you used to do things. That is the base of our curriculum. If you're interested in hearing more about that, please contact our office.